Picture this. You're living in the summer of 1914, and the world feels more connected than ever before. Telegraphs span continents, steamships cross oceans in record time, and everyone's talking about this new age of civilization and progress. The great powers of Europe are locked in an intricate web of alliances, each one supposedly designed to keep the peace. You probably think you're living in the most advanced, most rational era in human history. You probably won't survive what's coming next. Before we continue, if this feels like the kind of gentle escape into the past you've been craving, I'd love to have you subscribe and drift along with these historical journeys. Whether you fall asleep completely or just absorb a fascinating detail or two, you're getting exactly what you need right now. Take a moment to settle in, maybe dim those lights if that feels good, and know that for the next little while, there's nowhere else you need to be, because tonight, we're wrapping 4 years of history around you like the softest blanket. Let's drift back to Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is making what should be a routine visit to inspect military maneuvers. The morning starts badly when a bomb bounces off his car, injuring several bystanders but leaving the Archduke miraculously unharmed. Any sensible person would have called off the day's events, but Franz Ferdinand decides to visit the wounded in the hospital, a gesture of compassion that will accidentally trigger the bloodiest conflict in human history up to that point. Here's where fate gets absurdly specific. The Archduke's driver takes a wrong turn. Instead of following the planned route, he accidentally drives down Franz Joseph Street, realizes his mistake, and stops the car directly in front of a delicatessen to reverse direction. At that exact moment, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, one of several Serbian nationalist conspirators who had given up hope after the morning's failed bombing, happens to be buying a sandwich at that very delicatessen. Princip can't believe his eyes. The target of his assassination plot is sitting stationary just 5 feet away, with no security barrier between them. He pulls out his pistol and fires 2 shots. The first hits Franz Ferdinand in the neck, the second strikes his pregnant wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both die within minutes, their blood staining the upholstery of their open-topped car. But here's what makes this moment so tragically absurd. Franz Ferdinand was actually one of the few Habsburg leaders who favored giving more autonomy to Slavic peoples within the empire. His death removes perhaps the only major Austrian voice that might have prevented the coming catastrophe through peaceful reform. Instead, his assassination hands Austrian hardliners exactly the excuse they've been waiting for to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. The initial reaction in Vienna is surprisingly muted. Emperor Franz Joseph, who was never particularly fond of his nephew anyway, seems more annoyed than devastated. But behind closed doors, Austrian military leaders and their German allies begin calculating how to use this crisis to reshape the balance of power in the Balkans. They don't yet realize they're about to reshape the entire world. Within hours, telegraph wires across Europe start humming with diplomatic messages. The intricate alliance system that was supposed to prevent major wars begins operating exactly as designed, except instead of deterring conflict, it's about to spread a regional dispute across 3 continents. Austria-Hungary has Germany's backing through their dual alliance. Serbia can count on Russia's protection through pan-Slavic solidarity. Russia is bound to France through their military convention. And France has recently strengthened ties with Britain through the Entente Cordiale. What nobody quite grasps yet is that this web of mutual obligations is about to drag approximately 70 million soldiers into uniform over the next 4 years. The assassination of one relatively minor Austrian archduke, a man most Europeans couldn't have picked out of a lineup a week earlier, will ultimately lead to the deaths of somewhere between 15 and 22 million people, depending on how you count civilian casualties and disease-related deaths. As news of the assassination spreads through Europe's capitals, most government officials treat it as a manageable diplomatic crisis. Stock markets barely flutter. People go about their summer routines, planning vacations and attending garden parties. The beautiful, terrible irony is that almost everyone involved believes they're being perfectly rational, making measured responses to protect their national interests. None of them can see that they're all walking in lockstep toward an abyss that will swallow their entire civilization. The summer of 1914 unfolds with a strange, dreamlike quality as Europe's leaders stumble through a month of diplomatic theater that will end in absolute catastrophe. Each government believes it's acting defensively, responding rationally to threats from neighboring powers. What they're actually doing is performing an elaborate dance of mutual destruction, with each step making war more inevitable while everyone continues to believe peace is still possible. Austria-Hungary spends nearly a month crafting what they call an ultimatum, but what historians will remember as a declaration of intent to destroy Serbia. The document, delivered on July 23, contains 10 demands so humiliating that even Austria's own diplomats privately admit they're designed to be rejected. Serbia must allow Austrian police to operate on Serbian soil, suppress anti-Austrian publications, arrest suspects chosen by Vienna, and essentially surrender its sovereignty. It's like demanding that someone hand over the keys to their house after accusing them of looking at you funny. Remarkably, Serbia accepts almost everything. Their reply on July 25 agrees to 9 of the 10 demands and suggests international arbitration for the 10th. Any reasonable power would consider this a diplomatic victory. But Austria-Hungary isn't interested in reasonable solutions. They want a war that will settle the South Slavic question permanently. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia and immediately begins shelling Belgrade. Here's where the alliance system transforms a regional spat into global catastrophe. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, cannot allow Austria to crush Serbia without losing all credibility in the Balkans. On July 30, Tsar Nicholas II signs the order for general mobilization, not just partial mobilization against Austria, but full mobilization of all Russian forces. This single decision makes World War virtually inevitable, because Germany's entire military strategy depends on defeating France quickly before Russia can fully mobilize its massive armies. The German war plan, crafted by Alfred von Schlieffen and modified by Helmuth von Moltke, assumes Germany must fight a two-front war against both France and Russia. The only way to survive this nightmare scenario is to knock France out of the war within 6 weeks, then turn all German forces eastward against the slowly mobilizing Russians. But Schlieffen's plan has one fatal flaw. It requires German armies to march through Belgium, whose neutrality is guaranteed by Britain. Kaiser Wilhelm II spends these crucial days oscillating between panic and false confidence, sending increasingly erratic telegrams to his cousin Tsar Nicholas. Their correspondence reads like a family argument that's spiraling out of control, with both men desperately trying to pull back from the brink while their military machines push them forward. Willie and Nicky exchange messages about their shared desire for peace even as their generals finalize plans for unprecedented destruction. On August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia and begins mobilizing its forces westward toward France and Belgium. The German ultimatum to Belgium, delivered on August 2nd, demands passage for German armies and promises to respect Belgian sovereignty after the war ends. King Albert of Belgium reportedly tears up the ultimatum and declares that Belgium is a nation, not a road. It's a noble gesture that will cost his country 4 years of brutal occupation. Britain faces its own moment of decision. The Liberal government is deeply split, with many members opposing involvement in what they see as a purely continental dispute. But the German invasion of Belgium transforms the political calculus overnight. Britain's guarantee of Belgian neutrality, dating back to 1839, suddenly becomes a matter of national honor. More importantly, British strategists realized that German control of Belgian ports would pose an unacceptable threat to British naval supremacy. On August 4th, as German armies pour across the Belgian frontier, Britain's Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey reportedly stands at his office window watching the gas lamps being lit in the streets below. "The lamps are going out all over Europe," he tells a colleague. "We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." By midnight, Britain is at war with Germany, transforming what began as an Austrian punishment expedition against Serbia into a conflict spanning multiple continents. The speed of escalation is breathtaking. Within 6 weeks of the assassination, every major European power except Italy is mobilizing for war. Millions of men receive mobilization notices and report to railway stations amid scenes of patriotic enthusiasm that will seem bitterly ironic just months later. The alliance system that was supposed to deter aggression through the threat of overwhelming retaliation has instead created a situation where no power can back down without losing face and strategic position. Most tragically, almost everyone involved believes the war will be brief. German soldiers depart with flowers in their rifle barrels and chalk messages on railway cars promising to be home before the leaves fall. French troops march toward the frontier singing the Marseillaise and dreaming of quickly recapturing Alsace-Lorraine. British expeditionary forces cross the Channel expecting a short, victorious campaign that will restore the balance of power. None of them can imagine that they're marching into 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter that will reshape the entire world. The armies that march off to war in August 1914 carry more than rifles and artillery. They're loaded down with impossible expectations and romantic notions that will prove as fragile as morning frost. Across Europe, military timetables crafted in peacetime unfold with clockwork precision, moving millions of men toward frontiers where 19th-century cavalry charges are about to meet 20th-century machine guns. The results will be as predictable as they are horrifying. Germany's Schlieffen Plan initially works exactly as designed. 7 German armies sweep through Belgium like a grey tide, overwhelming Belgian fortresses that were supposed to hold out for months. The fortress of Liege, considered impregnable by military experts, falls in just 11 days to massive siege guns that the Germans have secretly transported by rail. These weapons, nicknamed Big Bertha after Gustav Krupp's wife, fire shells weighing nearly a ton and can punch through 9 feet of reinforced concrete. The sound of their firing can be heard 20 miles away, a mechanical thunder that announces the arrival of industrial warfare. French armies, following their own Plan 17, launch immediate offensives into Alsace-Lorraine wearing bright red trousers and blue coats that make them perfect targets for German riflemen. French military doctrine emphasizes élan vital, the belief that superior morale and aggressive spirit can overcome any material disadvantage. This philosophy leads to suicidal frontal attacks against entrenched German positions equipped with rapid-fire artillery and machine guns. In the Battle of the Frontiers during August 1914, France loses 329,000 casualties in just 4 days, more men than America lost during the entire Vietnam War. Meanwhile, the British Expeditionary Force, all 100,000 men of it, crosses the Channel and takes up positions near the Belgian town of Mons. These are professional soldiers, the old contemptibles as Kaiser Wilhelm reportedly calls them, trained to fire 15 accurate rifle rounds per minute. At the Battle of Mons on August 23rd, their disciplined volleys are so rapid and precise that German attackers believe they're facing machine gun nests rather than riflemen. But professionalism can't overcome mathematics. The British are simply outnumbered 10-1 and begin a fighting retreat that will last for 2 weeks. Here's where the war takes its first surprising turn. Just as German victory seems assured, the plan begins unraveling from within. Helmuth von Moltke, modifying Schlieffen's design, has weakened the crucial right wing by detaching troops to other fronts. More fatally, he loses direct communication with his field commanders as they advance beyond the range of telephone lines. German armies begin operating independently, creating gaps that French and British forces can exploit. The miracle, if you can call anything in this war miraculous, happens at the Mon River in early September. French commander Ferdinand Foch, whose army is retreating in apparent defeat, sends the message that will become legendary: "My center is giving way, my right is in retreat, situation excellent. I attack." The French counteroffensive, supported by British forces and reinforced by troops rushed from Paris in commandeered taxicabs, stops the German advance just 30 miles from the French capital. But here's the detail that reveals how close Germany came to winning the war in 1914. German advance units actually reached the suburbs of Paris. Patrols from the German Fourth Army establish outposts in villages where Parisians can see the smoke from their cooking fires. For a few terrifying days, it seems like the French government's decision to evacuate to Bordeaux was the right choice. Instead, the Battle of the Marne becomes the first great strategic defeat of German arms, forcing the invading armies to retreat to defensive positions along the Aisne River. What happens next changes the character of warfare forever. Both sides attempt to outflank each other in what historians call the race to the sea, a series of leapfrogging movements that extends the front line from the Swiss border to the English Channel. As each flanking attempt fails, armies dig in to protect themselves from increasingly deadly artillery fire. By October 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretches 475 miles across Western Europe, from the North Sea to the Alps. These aren't the elaborate trench systems that will define the war's later years. They're hastily scraped shallow ditches that offer minimal protection from shellfire and none at all from rain, mud, and disease. But they represent something unprecedented in military history: a front line so long and densely defended that neither side can find a way around it. The war of movement that all the generals planned for has become a war of position that none of them understand how to fight. The Christmas season of 1914 arrives with both armies dug into positions they thought would be temporary. Soldiers on both sides are now living underground, sharing their trenches with rats, lice, and the constant smell of death. The romantic notions of August, cavalry charges, glorious battles, quick decisive victories, have been replaced by the grim reality of industrial warfare. Artillery barrages can now last for hours, turning entire landscapes into moonscapes of mud and shattered trees. Yet remarkably, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself even in this mechanized hell. On Christmas Eve 1914, German soldiers along various parts of the front line begin singing carols and placing candles on their trench parapets. British and French soldiers respond with their own songs. In several locations, unofficial truces break out as men climb out of their trenches to meet in no man's land, exchange gifts, and even play football. Officers on both sides are horrified by this outbreak of humanity and quickly issue orders forbidding any future fraternization. The Christmas truce becomes one of the war's most poignant moments precisely because it represents the last gasp of the old world's values, the belief that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity. After 1914, High Command ensures that such spontaneous ceasefires never happen again. The war machine requires soldiers to see their opponents as targets rather than fellow human beings, and the Christmas truce threatens to undermine the hatred necessary for industrial-scale killing. As 1914 ends, the dreams of a short, decisive war lie buried in the mud of Flanders and the Marne. What was supposed to be a brief adjustment of European power balances has become something entirely new and terrible, a conflict that devours men and resources at rates no previous generation could have imagined. The year 1915 dawns with a terrible realization settling over Europe like winter fog. This war isn't going anywhere. The Western Front has crystallized into two parallel lines of trenches separated by a narrow strip of devastated ground that soldiers are already calling no man's land. Military leaders who spent decades planning for wars of rapid movement now face the unprecedented challenge of breaking through defensive positions that seem to grow stronger with each passing week. Into this stalemate steps the Ottoman Empire, that ancient power stretching from the Balkans to Mesopotamia. Sultan Mehmed V's decision to join Germany in October 1914 transforms what was already a European catastrophe into something approaching a world war. The Ottoman entry opens new fronts across 3 continents, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Suez Canal to the beaches of the Dardanelles. More importantly, it threatens to cut off Russia from its Western allies entirely, since the Ottomans control the crucial shipping routes through the Black Sea Straits. British strategists, led by First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, become obsessed with the idea of knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war through a single decisive blow. The concept seems elegant in its simplicity: force the Dardanelles Straits, capture Constantinople, and open a direct supply route to Russia while simultaneously bringing the Balkan states into the war on the Allied side. On paper, it looks like the kind of bold strategic stroke that could break the deadlock on all fronts. The reality begins unfolding on April 25, 1915, when British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces attempt simultaneous landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The plan immediately encounters problems that reveal just how little Allied commanders understand about modern defensive warfare. Turkish forces, commanded by a relatively unknown officer named Mustafa Kemal, have used the months since the failed naval attack to prepare defensive positions that turn the beaches into killing fields. At Anzac Cove, Australian and New Zealand troops find themselves pinned down on a narrow strip of beach overlooked by Turkish positions on the cliffs above. The landing craft deposit men directly into machine gun fire, and within hours the beach is littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. Similar disasters unfold at other landing sites, as British forces discover that naval bombardment, however impressive it looks and sounds, does little to suppress well-constructed defensive positions. Here's a detail that captures the surreal horror of Gallipoli. The opposing trenches are sometimes so close together that soldiers can hear conversations in enemy positions. At one point near Quinn's Post, Turkish and Australian trenches are separated by less than 8 yards, close enough to throw grenades back and forth like a deadly game of catch. Men live for months in these conditions, under constant sniper fire, sharing their cramped quarters with corpses they can't safely remove. But 1915 brings an innovation that makes even the trenches seem quaint by comparison. On April 22nd, near the Belgian town of Ypres, German forces open valves on thousands of metal cylinders, releasing 168 tons of chlorine gas across a 4-mile front. The yellowish-green cloud drifts slowly toward French and Canadian positions, carried by a favorable wind that German meteorologists have been monitoring for weeks. Soldiers who inhale the gas experience what doctors can only describe as drowning on dry land. Their lungs fill with fluid as the chlorine reacts with moisture in their respiratory systems. The psychological impact of gas warfare proves almost as devastating as its physical effects. There's something uniquely terrifying about an invisible death that seeps silently across the battlefield, ignoring the protection of trenches and earthworks that soldiers have learned to trust. The introduction of gas masks becomes routine, but these early models are primitive affairs, little more than cloth soaked in chemicals, that offer limited protection and make everything else more difficult. Imagine trying to fight a war while breathing through a wet rag that smells like a chemistry experiment. Gas attacks create a new category of casualty. Men who survive the immediate effects but spend the rest of their lives struggling with damaged lungs and recurring respiratory infections. Unlike bullet wounds or shrapnel injuries, gas damage often remains invisible, leading to a lifetime of quiet suffering that doesn't show up in the official casualty statistics. The Germans justify gas warfare as more humane than high-explosive shells, arguing that it incapacitates rather than kills, but this logic ignores the prolonged agony of gas victims. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front develops its own character as Russian and German forces clash across the vast distances between the Baltic and the Black Sea. Unlike the static trench warfare in the West, fighting in the East involves massive movements across hundreds of miles of territory. The Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914 had already demonstrated that modern weapons could produce casualties on a scale that dwarfs any previous conflict. The Russians lost 92,000 men in a single engagement. Throughout 1915, the Central Powers achieve a series of stunning victories against Russian forces. The Brusilov offensive, named after the Russian general who conceived it, initially breaks through Austrian lines and advances deep into Galicia. But German reinforcements quickly contain the breakthrough, and the offensive degenerates into the same kind of bloody stalemate that characterizes the Western Front. By the end of 1915, Russia has lost approximately 2 million casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, yet the front lines have barely moved. The Ottoman Empire's entry also opens fighting in the Middle East, where British and Indian forces find themselves battling through some of the world's most inhospitable terrain. The Mesopotamian campaign begins promisingly enough, with British forces quickly capturing Basra and advancing up the Tigris River toward Baghdad. But the same overconfidence that led to disaster at Gallipoli produces another catastrophe at Kut al-Amara, where an entire British division surrenders after a siege that lasts 147 days. Perhaps the most telling detail about 1915 is that by year's end, every major power involved in the conflict has experienced both crushing victories and humiliating defeats, yet none of them is any closer to achieving their original war aims. The German advance has been stopped, but German forces still occupy most of Belgium and significant portions of northern France. The Ottoman Empire has successfully defended the Dardanelles, but British naval blockade is slowly strangling their economy. Russia has survived the German offensive, but at a cost in human life that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. As winter settles over the various fronts, soldiers on all sides begin to understand that they're participants in something unprecedented. A war that consumes men, money, and materials at rates that exceed every government's ability to replace them, yet somehow continues expanding rather than burning itself out. By early 1916, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn has reached a coldly logical conclusion about the war's trajectory. Germany cannot win through breakthrough battles that don't exist anymore, but it might achieve victory by simply bleeding France to death. His plan, codenamed Operation Judgment, targets the fortress city of Verdun not because of its strategic value, but because he believes the French will sacrifice unlimited numbers of men to defend it. Falkenhayn wants to create what he calls a mincing machine that will consume French reserves faster than they can be replaced. Verdun seems perfect for this diabolic purpose. The city sits in a salient that bulges into German lines, surrounded by a ring of concrete forts that represent decades of French military engineering. More importantly, Verdun carries emotional weight that transcends its military significance. It's been a fortress city since Roman times, and its fall would represent a psychological catastrophe that the French government might not survive. Falkenhayn calculates that France will feed entire armies into Verdun's defense, allowing German artillery to slaughter them from prepared positions. The German offensive begins on February 21, 1916, with an artillery bombardment that exceeds anything previously seen in warfare. Over 1,400 guns fire continuously for 10 hours, hurling more than 1 million shells into an area roughly the size of Manhattan. The sound can be heard 100 miles away in the Vosges Mountains, a mechanical thunder that seems to shake the earth itself. French positions simply disappear under this avalanche of steel and high explosive, leaving behind a moonscape of overlapping shell craters. Here's a detail that reveals the battle's unprecedented scale. The preliminary bombardment alone fires more artillery shells than the entire American Civil War consumed in 4 years. German gunners target not just military positions but the very landscape itself, systematically destroying every building, tree, and recognizable landmark within the fortress ring. The goal is to create such complete devastation that French reinforcements will become lost trying to navigate terrain that no longer bears any resemblance to their maps. Initially, the plan works exactly as Falkenhayn intended. German infantry, advancing behind a creeping artillery barrage, captures several major forts in the first few days of fighting. Fort Douaumont, the strongest position in the entire defensive system, falls to a small German patrol that simply walks through an unguarded entrance. The loss sends shockwaves through Paris, where government officials begin discussing the possibility of abandoning Verdun entirely rather than sacrificing the French army in its defense. But Falkenhayn has made a crucial miscalculation about French national character. Instead of cutting their losses, the French government appoints General Philippe Pétain to organize Verdun's defense and issues the order that will define the entire battle: they shall not pass. Pétain transforms Verdun into a symbol of French determination, rotating entire divisions through the battlefield every few days to prevent any unit from being completely destroyed. This system, which French soldiers call the Sacred Way, ensures that almost every French family will have some personal connection to Verdun's defense. The logistics of supplying Verdun become almost as challenging as the fighting itself. German artillery has cut the main railway line, leaving only a single narrow road to connect the fortress city with the French rear areas. Along this road, which soldiers nickname the Sacred Way, an endless convoy of trucks carries ammunition, food, and fresh troops into the battle while evacuating wounded and exhausted survivors. At peak periods, A vehicle passes every 14 seconds, maintaining a flow of supplies that keeps the defense alive despite impossible conditions. As weeks turn into months, Verdun transforms into something that transcends normal military categories. The battlefield becomes a landscape of pure destruction where shell craters overlap so completely that the original ground level disappears entirely. Trees are reduced to splintered stumps, buildings become piles of rubble, and even the dead cannot rest in peace. Artillery fire repeatedly churns up buried corpses, mixing human remains with mud and shrapnel in a grotesque stew that coats everything. The psychological toll proves almost as devastating as the physical casualties. Soldiers develop a condition that doctors call shell shock, but which psychiatrists won't properly understand for decades. Men who survive Verdun often return home unable to sleep without nightmares, jumping at sudden noises, and struggling with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The constant artillery bombardment creates a form of torture that no previous generation of soldiers had to endure. French forces develop an almost mystical attachment to holding every yard of ground around Verdun. When German attacks capture a position, French counterattacks invariably follow within hours, regardless of cost. This produces a cycle of attack and counterattack that consumes enormous numbers of men for gains measured in tens of yards. A single hill might change hands a dozen times in a single day, with each assault leaving more bodies scattered across ground that's already carpeted with the dead. By summer 1916, Verdun has indeed become the mincing machine that Falkenhayn envisioned, but it's consuming German reserves almost as quickly as French ones. German casualties mount steadily as they discover that attacking well-prepared defensive positions is even more costly than defending them. More problematically, the battle is lasting far longer than German planners anticipated. Instead of bleeding France to death in a few months, Verdun settles into a 10-month siege that strains both armies beyond their breaking points. The battle's most horrifying aspect may be its routine nature. After months of continuous fighting, soldiers on both sides develop an almost casual attitude toward carnage that would have horrified their pre-war selves. Men eat their meals while sitting on corpses, sleep in shell holes filled with body parts, and conduct conversations while artillery shells explode around them. The human capacity for adaptation proves both remarkable and terrifying in its ability to normalize the abnormal. Perhaps the strangest detail about Verdun is that by the time fighting finally ends in December 1916, the front lines have barely moved from their February positions. The Germans briefly capture some forward positions, the French recapture most of them, and both sides are left holding essentially the same ground they started with. The only measurable result is approximately 700,000 casualties, roughly equal losses for both armies in a battle that achieves nothing except demonstrating the futility of attrition warfare. Verdun becomes a sacred site for both nations, but for opposite reasons. French memory celebrates it as proof that determined defense can overcome any assault, while Germans remember it as evidence that even their most carefully planned offensives cannot break enemy morale. Both sides draw lessons from Verdun that will influence their strategies for the remainder of the war, though neither lesson proves particularly helpful for ending the conflict. While French and German forces are grinding each other to pieces at Verdun, British commanders are preparing their own contribution to 1916's catalogue of military disasters. The Battle of the Somme, scheduled to begin on July 1st, represents everything that British military thinking has learned about modern warfare, which, as it turns out, is almost nothing useful. General Douglas Haig and his staff have spent months planning what they call the Big Push, a massive offensive that will finally break through German lines and restore the war of movement that everyone still dreams about. The British plan follows the same logic that has failed repeatedly on every front. A massive artillery bombardment will destroy German defensive positions, allowing infantry to walk across no man's land and occupy the abandoned trenches. What makes the Somme different is the sheer scale of British preparations. For 7 days and nights, 1,537 British guns fire continuously along a 14-mile front, hurling 1.7 million shells into German positions. The bombardment is so intense that it can be heard in London, 200 miles away, a distant rumbling that Londoners mistake for summer thunder. British artillery officers confidently predict that nothing can survive this unprecedented deluge of steel and high explosive. They're using shells manufactured in the factories of Britain's rapidly expanding war economy, produced by workers who've never seen a battlefield but who believe they're crafting the tools of victory. The shells bear chalk messages from munitions workers, "Give the Kaiser one from Birmingham," or compliments of Sheffield. It's a touching display of home front solidarity that will prove tragically irrelevant to the battle's outcome. Here's the detail that reveals just how disconnected British commanders are from battlefield reality. They order their infantry to advance in neat, evenly spaced waves, walking rather than running, because they believe German resistance will be minimal. Officers carry walking sticks instead of rifles, expecting to spend the day directing traffic rather than fighting battles. Some units are ordered to advance with bayonets fixed but rifles unloaded, since enemy opposition is expected to be so light that actual fighting seems unlikely. The German response to 7 days of continuous bombardment demonstrates why they've been winning this war despite being outnumbered. Instead of cowering in shallow trenches, German engineers have spent 2 years digging elaborate underground bunkers, some extending 40 feet below ground level. These Stahlen, as Germans call them, are complete subterranean cities equipped with electric lighting, ventilation systems, and enough supplies to survive prolonged sieges. When British shells explode overhead, German soldiers simply retreat into their underground shelters and wait for the bombardment to end. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1, 1916, British artillery shifts its fire to targets deeper behind German lines, signaling the beginning of the infantry assault. Across 14 miles of front, approximately 120,000 British soldiers climb out of their trenches and begin walking toward German positions. The sight is simultaneously magnificent and terrible. Row after row of men advancing with parade ground precision across the shell-scarred landscape of no man's land. What happens next unfolds with the mechanical inevitability of a factory accident. German soldiers emerge from their underground shelters, set up their machine guns, and begin firing into the advancing British formations. Maxim guns, firing 600 rounds per minute, create interlocking fields of fire that turn no man's land into a death trap. British soldiers, weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment and trained to maintain their neat formations, become perfect targets for weapons specifically designed to slaughter large numbers of men quickly. The Newfoundland Regiment provides perhaps the most tragic example of July 1 SD's catastrophe. These men, recruited from fishing villages and lumber camps across Canada's easternmost province, advance from trenches near the village of Beaumont-Hamel. German machine guns catch them in the open, and within 30 minutes, 684 of the regiment's 780 men are casualties. The few survivors crawl back to their starting positions through grass that's literally carpeted with the bodies of their friends and neighbours. Similar disasters unfold all along the British front. The Ulster Division, composed of Protestant volunteers from Northern Ireland, initially captures some German trenches near Thiepval but becomes isolated when attacks on either flank fail. German counterattacks gradually eliminate these pockets of success, leaving behind hundreds of orange sashes, the traditional Ulster Protestant symbol, scattered across the battlefield. Catholic Irish units attacking nearby suffer equally heavy casualties, creating a grim irony in which the religious divisions that were tearing Ireland apart become irrelevant in the democracy of death. By the end of July 1st, British forces have suffered approximately 60,000 casualties, 19,240 killed and 35,493 wounded, making it the bloodiest single day in British military history. To put this in perspective, Britain loses more men in one morning than the United States lost during the entire Vietnam War. Yet the territorial gains are almost non-existent. The deepest British penetration reaches barely 1 mile into German lines, and most attacks fail to capture any ground at all. Here's the most damning detail about the Sommer's first day. British commanders somehow interpret this catastrophe as a partial success that justifies continuing the offensive. Haig's diary entry for July 1st notes that the situation is favourable, and he immediately begins planning follow-up attacks that will supposedly exploit the day's achievements. This represents a level of disconnect from reality that borders on the pathological, yet it's entirely consistent with the mentality that has prolonged this war far beyond any rational endpoint. The Battle of the Somme continues for another 4 months, as British forces repeatedly attack the same German positions with the same tactics that failed on July 1st. Each assault produces thousands of casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The introduction of tanks in September 1916 provides a brief moment of tactical innovation, but these primitive machines break down faster than they can be repaired, and British commanders haven't yet figured out how to use them effectively. The most horrifying aspect of the Somme may be its demonstration that industrial warfare has made individual courage irrelevant. British soldiers display the same bravery that won the Empire, charging machine gun nests with the same determination their grandfathers showed at Waterloo. But courage cannot overcome mathematics, and mathematics clearly favor defenders equipped with rapid-fire weapons shooting at attackers crossing open ground. When the Battle of the Somme finally ends in November 1916, British forces have advanced approximately 6 miles along a front that's 14 miles wide. The territorial gains represent less than 1% of the ground needed to reach Germany's industrial heartland. Meanwhile, British casualties total over 400,000 men, while German losses approach 500,000. Both sides have bled themselves white for what amounts to a few square miles of shell-torn French countryside that's now completely worthless for any purpose except burying the dead. The Somme becomes the British Empire's Verdun, a battle that transcends military significance to become a national trauma that shapes how an entire generation understands warfare, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual lives and national purposes. As the year 1917 dawns over the blood-soaked battlefields of Europe, 2 seismic shifts are about to fundamentally alter the war's trajectory in ways that no military planner could have predicted. While generals continue planning their next great offensive, political foundations are crumbling beneath their feet. In Russia, bread lines stretch around city blocks as the Tsarist system finally buckles under pressures that have been building for decades. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, President Woodrow Wilson wrestles with a decision that will transform America from neutral observer into the conflict's decisive participant. The Russian Revolution begins not with grand political gestures but with something as mundane as bread shortages in Petrograd. By March 1917, Russian women are spending entire days queuing for loaves that may not exist, while their husbands and sons die in trenches for a war effort that has already consumed over 6 million Russian casualties. The mathematics of revolution are surprisingly simple. When people can no longer feed their families, they stop caring about the divine right of kings. Tsar Nicholas II, meanwhile, remains almost comically oblivious to his empire's disintegration. While his capital city erupts in strikes and demonstrations, he's at military headquarters hundreds of miles away, playing dominoes and writing diary entries about the weather. When his own generals finally inform him that the army will no longer fire on protesters, Nicholas responds by abdicating the throne as casually as if he's resigning from a gentleman's club. 300 years of Romanov rule end with a man shrugging and signing a piece of paper in a railway carriage. Here's a detail that captures the revolution's surreal quality. When protesters storm the Winter Palace, they discover that the imperial wine cellars contain over 700,000 bottles of the world's finest vintages. What follows is perhaps history's most expensive drinking binge, as revolutionaries consume wines that cost more than most Russians earn in a lifetime. The provisional government eventually has to bring in military units to stop the looting, but not before thousands of bottles of Napoleon-era champagne disappear into the Petrograd streets. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, makes the fatal decision to continue fighting the war despite having no money, no effective army, and no popular support for further sacrifice. Kerensky launches the June offensive, hoping that military success will legitimize his government and restore Russian morale. Instead, the offensive collapses within days, triggering mass desertions that turn retreat into complete rout. Russian soldiers begin voting with their feet, simply walking away from trenches and heading home to participate in land redistributions that are already beginning in the countryside. This creates an opportunity that Vladimir Lenin seizes with both hands. Returning from exile in Switzerland via the famous sealed train provided by German intelligence services, Lenin arrives at Petrograd's Finland station with a program that reduces the revolution's complexity to 3 simple words: peace, land, bread. While other revolutionary leaders debate constitutional theory, Lenin promises to end the war immediately, redistribute aristocratic estates to peasants, and solve the food crisis that started the revolution in the first place. But while Russia dissolves into chaos, events on the other side of the Atlantic are pushing America toward war with equal inevitability. German submarine warfare has been escalating throughout 1916, as U-boat commanders struggle to break the British naval blockade that's slowly strangling the German economy. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted by British intelligence in January 1917, reveals German attempts to forge an alliance with Mexico against the United States. The telegram promises that Mexico will regain Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if Germany wins the war, a proposal so audacious that many Americans initially assume it must be a British forgery. President Wilson, who won re-election in 1916 on the slogan "He kept us out of war," now faces the political reality that neutrality has become impossible. German U-boats are sinking American merchant ships faster than they can be replaced, and German diplomats are actively plotting against American territorial integrity. On April 2, 1917, Wilson appears before Congress to request a declaration of war, famously stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, America formally enters the conflict that will transform it from a regional power into a global hegemon. American entry triggers the largest military mobilization in the nation's history up to that point. The Selective Service Act requires all men between 21 and 30 to register for potential military service, and within months, training camps across the country are processing hundreds of thousands of recruits. These doughboys, as they're quickly nicknamed, represent something new in American military history: a citizen army drawn from every ethnic group and social class, united by the belief that they're fighting to end war itself. But America's impact won't be felt immediately on European battlefields. It takes months to train, equip, and transport an army across the Atlantic, and German commanders understand that they have a narrow window of opportunity before American forces arrive in decisive numbers. More immediately significant is the continuing collapse of Russian resistance, which allows Germany to transfer dozens of divisions from the Eastern to the Western Front for the first time since 1914. By autumn 1917, the situation on the Eastern Front has deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. The Bolshevik Revolution in October brings Lenin to power with a mandate to end Russian participation in the war at any cost. Lenin's government immediately begins negotiating with the Central Powers for a separate peace, despite the fact that such negotiations violate Russia's agreements with Britain and France. From Lenin's perspective, international treaties signed by the Tsarist regime have no validity for a revolutionary government that repudiates everything the old system represented. The German response to Russian collapse reveals just how much the war has changed since those optimistic days of August 1914. Instead of offering generous peace terms that might encourage other Allied powers to negotiate, Germany demands territorial concessions that amount to dismembering the Russian Empire. German negotiators insist on annexing Poland, the Baltic states, and large portions of Ukraine, effectively stripping Russia of 1/3 of its European territory and half of its industrial capacity. These harsh terms reflect Germany's growing desperation as much as its apparent strength. The British naval blockade has reduced German civilians to eating turnips and bread made from sawdust, while the war economy consumes resources faster than they can be replaced. German leaders understand that they must achieve decisive victory in 1918 or face inevitable defeat as American forces reach full strength. The Eastern Front's collapse provides the additional divisions needed for one final gamble, but time is running out for the Central Powers just as surely as it is for their enemies. As 1917 ends, the war has fundamentally changed character. What began as a European balance of power conflict has become a global struggle between competing ideologies, with American industrial might and Bolshevik revolutionary fervor both entering the equation for the first time. America's entry into the Great War triggers the most massive peacetime mobilization in human history, transforming a nation that could barely field 100,000 regular troops into a military colossus capable of projecting power across oceans. The scale of this transformation defies comprehension. Imagine trying to create, equip, and transport an entirely new army larger than the entire population of Philadelphia, all while simultaneously converting the world's largest economy from civilian production to military manufacturing. The logistics alone would challenge a modern superpower. In 1917, it represents an undertaking that dwarfs the construction of the Panama Canal. The Selective Service Registration on June 5, 1917, becomes a defining moment in American democracy. Nearly 10 million men between ages 21 and 30 report to local draft boards, creating lines that stretch for blocks in cities across the nation. Unlike the chaotic volunteer system that characterized previous American wars, the draft operates with industrial efficiency that reflects the progressive era's faith in scientific management. Local boards, staffed by community leaders who know their neighbors personally, make decisions about who serves and who stays home to support the war effort. Training these citizen soldiers presents challenges that no military institution has ever faced before. Camp Devens in Massachusetts swells from empty fields to a city of 45,000 men within months, complete with hospitals, theaters, libraries, and even its own newspaper. The young men who arrive at these training camps represent every corner of American society. Farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from New England, and recent immigrants still learning English. Their transformation into soldiers requires not just military training but a complete reimagining of American identity itself. Here's a detail that captures the mobilization's staggering scope. The U.S. Army grows from 128,000 men in April 1917 to over 3.7 million by November 1918, an increase of nearly 3,000% in 18 months. To put this in perspective, it's equivalent to creating an entirely new military force larger than the current population of Los Angeles, training it to professional standards, and deploying it to fight on foreign soil, all while maintaining normal civilian economic functions. The home front transformation proves equally dramatic. American industry, already the world's most productive, shifts into what can only be described as overdrive. Henry Ford's Highland Park factory, which revolutionized automobile production, now applies assembly line techniques to manufacturing Liberty engines for aircraft. Bethlehem Steel expands its facilities so rapidly that entire towns spring up around new plants, their populations drawn from across the country by wages that seem impossibly generous by peacetime standards. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs that social convention had reserved exclusively for men just months earlier. Rosie the Riveter hasn't been invented yet, but her prototype is already working in munitions factories, shipyards, and steel mills across industrial America. These women discover that they can operate complex machinery, supervise production lines, and earn wages that provide genuine economic independence for the first time in their lives. The social implications won't be fully understood until after the war ends, but the foundation for women's suffrage is being laid in factory floors and production statistics. The challenge of transporting this massive force across the Atlantic reveals both American ingenuity and the war's unprecedented logistical demands. The United States confiscates German passenger liners interned in American ports, converts them into troop transports, and operates them alongside hastily constructed cargo vessels that shipyards are producing at rates that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The convoy system, developed by the British Royal Navy to counter German U-boat warfare, becomes the lifeline that connects American industrial production with European battlefields. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, faces political pressures that complicate his military mission in ways that previous American commanders never had to consider. British and French leaders, desperate for fresh troops to replace their enormous casualties, want to integrate American soldiers directly into their existing armies. Pershing refuses, insisting that American forces will fight as a unified national army under American command. This decision reflects both practical military considerations and deeper questions about American identity. Are American soldiers fighting to save European democracy, or to establish America as a global power equal to Britain and France? The cultural mobilization proves as significant as the military and industrial efforts. The Committee on Public Information, led by journalist George Creel, launches the most sophisticated propaganda campaign in American history up to that point. Hollywood stars sell war bonds, popular songs celebrate American virtues, and posters featuring Uncle Sam pointing directly at viewers declare that "I want you for U.S. Army." This represents the first time that modern advertising techniques are systematically applied to political mobilization, creating a template that will influence American politics for generations. Here's a striking detail about American war bond drives. They raise over $17 billion from citizens who are essentially lending money to their own government to fight a war on another continent. Children bring pennies to school, factories organize payroll deduction programs, and entire communities compete to exceed their bond purchase quotas. This isn't just fundraising, it's a massive exercise in democratic participation that gives ordinary Americans a direct stake in the war's outcome. The speed of American deployment overseas accelerates throughout 1918 as the convoy system becomes increasingly efficient. By summer 1918, American forces are arriving in France at a rate of over 250,000 men per month, a logistical achievement that German planners had calculated was impossible. These fresh troops, arriving with full equipment and high morale, provide Allied commanders with a resource that had been unavailable since the war's early months. Reserve forces that haven't been ground down by years of attrition warfare. But American soldiers quickly discover that their training, however thorough, hasn't prepared them for the realities of industrial warfare. Veterans of Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne offensive will later describe their shock at encountering landscapes where absolutely nothing remains alive. Not trees, not grass, not even insects. The Western Front represents a form of environmental destruction that Americans, raised in a nation of abundant natural resources, find almost incomprehensible. The American impact extends beyond mere numbers. These doughboys bring with them technologies and techniques that reflect America's industrial superiority, better communications equipment, more efficient logistics systems, and manufacturing methods that can produce standardized equipment in quantities that overwhelm German defensive calculations. More importantly, they represent proof that the Allies can replace their losses indefinitely, while German resources are clearly approaching exhaustion. By late 1918, American factories are producing military equipment at rates that exceed the consumption of all Allied armies combined. The productive capacity that built the transcontinental railroads and steel mills that span entire states has been focused on a single objective: ending the war through sheer material superiority. It's an approach that will characterize American military strategy for the rest of the 20th century. By March 1918, German High Command faces a strategic calculation as stark as any gambler's final bet. Russia's collapse has freed up nearly 1 million German soldiers from the Eastern Front, providing the first opportunity since 1914 to achieve numerical superiority in the West. But this window is closing rapidly as American forces arrive in France at an accelerating pace. General Erich Ludendorff, now effectively Germany's military dictator, understands that Germany must achieve decisive victory within months or face inevitable defeat as Allied material superiority becomes overwhelming. The plan that emerges from this desperation becomes known as the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, though history will remember it as Germany's spring offensive. Ludendorff abandons the failed tactics of previous years, developing instead a revolutionary approach that emphasizes speed, surprise, and concentrated force rather than prolonged artillery bombardments that telegraph German intentions. Small units of specially trained stormtroopers will infiltrate Allied lines, bypassing strong points and creating chaos in rear areas while follow-up forces exploit the confusion. These stormtroopers represent something genuinely new in military history. Selected for physical fitness, tactical intelligence, and aggressive initiative, they're equipped with lightweight weapons, submachine guns, grenades, and portable mortars, that allow rapid movement across broken terrain. More importantly, they're trained to think independently rather than simply following orders, making tactical decisions that previous military doctrine reserved for officers. It's a recognition that modern warfare requires adaptability rather than blind obedience. The offensive begins at 4:40 a.m. on March 21, 1918, with an artillery bombardment that surpasses even Verdun in its intensity. Over 6,000 German guns fire continuously for 5 hours, hurling shells that contain not just high explosive but a deadly cocktail of poison gas designed to penetrate British gas masks. The sound is so overwhelming that men standing next to each other must communicate through hand signals, their voices completely lost in the mechanical thunder that seems to shake the earth itself. Here's a detail that captures the bombardment's unprecedented scale. German gunners fire more artillery shells in 5 hours than the entire American Civil War consumed in 4 years. The barrage is so intense that British communication trenches simply disappear, buried under thousands of tons of earth thrown up by exploding shells. Telephone lines are severed, runners are killed before they can deliver messages, and entire British units become isolated islands in a sea of destruction. When German stormtroopers emerge from their trenches in thick fog that provides perfect concealment, they encounter British defensive positions that have been pulverized into unrecognizable moonscapes. The carefully constructed trench systems that defined the Western Front for 4 years prove worthless against tactics that emphasize infiltration rather than frontal assault. German units advance through gaps in British lines, some penetrating over 10 miles on the first day, farther than any force has advanced on the Western Front since 1914. The psychological impact proves almost as devastating as the physical destruction. British soldiers who have grown accustomed to static trench warfare suddenly find German troops attacking from directions that should be safely behind friendly lines. Communication breakdowns mean that many units don't realize they're being surrounded until German machine gunners open fire from positions that were supposedly secure just hours earlier. The result is a level of confusion that approaches panic, as the rigid command structure of trench warfare proves incapable of responding to fluid tactical situations. For several terrifying weeks, it appears that Ludendorff's gamble might succeed. German forces capture more territory in the first days of the spring offensive than Allied armies have gained in the previous 3 years of fighting. The British Fifth Army, commanded by General Hubert Gough, essentially disintegrates under the German assault, with entire divisions retreating in disorder while abandoning equipment that took months to accumulate. German advance units reach points where they can actually see the spires of Amiens Cathedral, a key railway junction whose loss would split British and French forces and potentially end the war. But Germany's apparent success contains the seeds of its own failure. Stormtroopers, advancing faster than supply lines can follow, begin suffering from the same problems that have plagued offensive operations throughout the war. Artillery support becomes less effective as guns must be moved forward across terrain churned into impassable mud by years of bombardment. More critically, German soldiers discover abandoned Allied supply dumps stocked with food, alcohol, and consumer goods that have been unavailable in Germany for years due to the British naval blockade. Here's a shocking detail about the German offensive's collapse. Entire units stop fighting to loot Allied supply depots, consuming white bread, chocolate, and wine while their officers struggle to restore discipline. German soldiers, who have been subsisting on turnip soup and ersatz coffee for months, become literally drunk on the abundance they discover in British and French positions. Some units spend entire days consuming alcohol rather than pursuing retreating Allied forces, allowing the enemy time to establish new defensive lines. The German advance also reveals the full extent of their strategic predicament. While stormtrooper tactics can break through Allied lines, Germany lacks the reserves needed to exploit these breakthroughs decisively. Each successful attack consumes the elite troops that make the tactics possible, while Allied forces can retreat to prepared positions and await reinforcements that are arriving from Britain and America at rates that Germany cannot match. By May 1918, it becomes clear that Germany is winning tactical battles while losing the strategic war. The human cost of the spring offensive defies comprehension even by this war's standards. Germany loses approximately 800,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, in just 4 months of fighting. These aren't ordinary soldiers but the cream of the German army, the stormtroopers and experienced veterans whose loss cannot be replaced. Allied casualties approach similar numbers, but Britain and France can draw on American reinforcements while Germany's manpower reserves are approaching exhaustion. Perhaps most tellingly, the spring offensive transforms the war's character in ways that favor the Allies. The static trench warfare that had stalemated both sides since 1914 gives way to mobile operations that play to Allied strengths, superior logistics, more abundant equipment, and the ability to replace losses indefinitely. German forces, stretched across extended front lines and lacking adequate reserves, become vulnerable to the kind of coordinated counteroffensives that will define the war's final months. By summer 1918, Ludendorff's great gamble has clearly failed. German armies that advanced triumphantly in March are now retreating toward defensive positions that are weaker than those they abandoned 4 months earlier. The spring offensive has consumed Germany's last strategic reserves while demonstrating that even tactical brilliance cannot overcome fundamental material disadvantages. The Kaiser's battle has become the Kaiser's funeral, though few participants yet realize that they're witnessing the death throes of Imperial Germany itself. Just as German hopes for victory are crumbling under the weight of their failed spring offensive, an enemy far more deadly than any human army begins stalking the battlefields of Europe. In the overcrowded military camps, packed troop transports, and rat-infested trenches where millions of soldiers live in conditions that would horrify a medieval peasant, a new strain of influenza is quietly mutating into something that will kill more people than all the artillery shells, machine gun bullets, and poison gas attacks of the previous 4 years combined. The pandemic that history will call the Spanish flu has nothing particularly Spanish about it. The name sticks only because Spain, remaining neutral in the war, doesn't censor news reports about the disease's devastating effects. The first documented outbreak actually occurs in March 1918 at Camp Funston in Kansas, where a company cook named Albert Gitchell reports to the infirmary complaining of fever, sore throat, and headache. Within hours, dozens of soldiers are showing similar symptoms. Within days, the illness spreads to other military installations across the American Midwest, carried by the constant movement of troops preparing for deployment to France. Military doctors initially dismissed this outbreak as ordinary seasonal flu, perhaps slightly more severe than usual, but nothing that healthy young soldiers can't handle. This assessment proves catastrophically wrong. The 1918 influenza strain possesses characteristics that make it uniquely suited for the conditions of global warfare. It spreads rapidly through crowded populations, thrives in the unsanitary conditions that characterize military life, and most unusually, it kills primarily healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 40 rather than the very young and very old who typically succumb to seasonal flu. Here's a detail that reveals just how perfectly adapted this virus is to wartime conditions. The flu spreads fastest among the very populations that armies depend on most, physically fit young men living in close quarters with inadequate medical facilities. A single infected soldier boarding a troop transport can infect hundreds of his companions during the Atlantic crossing, creating floating plague ships that arrive in European ports carrying disease along with reinforcements. The pandemic reaches Europe just as the German spring offensive is reaching its climax, creating a surreal situation where armies are fighting each other while simultaneously battling an invisible enemy that respects no national boundaries or military allegiances. German stormtroopers advancing through captured British positions discover that their enemy is retreating not just from German attacks but from something far more terrifying. Entire units decimated by an illness that can kill healthy soldiers faster than machine gun fire. By summer 1918, military hospitals across Europe are overwhelmed not with battle casualties but with flu victims whose symptoms defy every known medical intervention. Patients develop what doctors call heliotrope cyanosis, a distinctive blue-black discoloration around the lips and ears caused by oxygen starvation as the virus destroys lung tissue. Men who were marching with their units in the morning are dead by evening, their bodies literally drowning in fluids produced by their own immune system's overreaction to the infection. The war's global logistics network, designed to move men and supplies across vast distances with unprecedented efficiency, becomes the perfect distribution system for pandemic disease. Troopships carry infected soldiers from American training camps to French ports, where they spread the virus to British and Canadian forces before being transported to frontline positions where French, German, Australian, and South African troops all become exposed. Within months, the same railway networks that supply the trenches are also carrying infection to every corner of the combatant nations. Here's perhaps the pandemic's most tragic irony. The very medical advances that have allowed armies to treat battlefield wounds more effectively prove useless against influenza. Field hospitals equipped with the latest surgical techniques and staffed by doctors who've mastered the treatment of gunshot wounds and gas poisoning find themselves helpless against a microscopic enemy they can't see, understand, or fight. Many military physicians become victims themselves, further degrading medical care just when it's needed most. The flu's impact on military operations becomes impossible to ignore by autumn 1918. The American Expeditionary Force, which was supposed to provide the fresh manpower needed for decisive Allied offensives, loses more soldiers to influenza than to German bullets during several crucial months. General Pershing's carefully planned assaults must be postponed when entire divisions become unfit for combat due to illness rather than enemy action. German commanders face similar problems as their already depleted forces are further weakened by pandemic losses they cannot afford. But the pandemic's most devastating effects occur far from the battlefields, in the civilian populations that have already been weakened by 4 years of wartime privation. In Britain, where German submarine warfare has reduced food imports to starvation levels, malnourished civilians prove especially vulnerable to influenza complications. French factory workers, laboring long hours to produce munitions while subsisting on increasingly meager rations, succumb to the flu at rates that threaten to collapse war production entirely. The disease strikes with particularly vicious efficiency in the overcrowded urban areas where war industries have concentrated populations under conditions that would be considered inhumane during peacetime. In Philadelphia, so many people die during the pandemic's peak that bodies stack up in morgues, private homes, and even on city streets while authorities struggle to arrange mass burials. Similar scenes unfold in industrial centers across the combatant nations, creating public health catastrophes that dwarf the military casualties making headlines. Perhaps most unnervingly, The 1918 flu seems to target precisely the demographic that societies depend on for their economic and military strength. Unlike typical seasonal flu, which primarily kills infants and elderly people, this pandemic preferentially destroys healthy adults in their prime productive years. Families lose breadwinners, factories lose their most skilled workers, and armies lose soldiers faster to disease than to enemy action. The pandemic also reveals how completely the war has disrupted normal social structures designed to cope with public health emergencies. Traditional community support networks have been shattered by military conscription that has removed young men from their home communities, while women have been recruited into war work that leaves them unavailable for traditional caregiving roles. Churches, schools, and civic organizations that might normally coordinate disaster response are operating with skeleton staffs or have been converted to war-related purposes. By the time the pandemic finally begins to subside in late 1918, it has fundamentally altered the war's trajectory in ways that go far beyond simple casualty statistics. Military units that were supposed to deliver decisive blows against enemy positions instead find themselves quarantined in their own trenches. War economies that were geared toward maximum production collapse as their workforces are decimated by illness. Most importantly, civilian populations that had endured 4 years of unprecedented sacrifice now face a mortality crisis that makes the war's casualties seem almost manageable by comparison. The Spanish flu ultimately kills between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, more than 3 times the total military casualties of World War I. But unlike war deaths, which at least serve some political purpose, pandemic deaths seem utterly random and meaningless, striking down civilians who had nothing to do with the political disputes that started the conflict in the first place. While the Spanish flu ravages populations across Europe, the ancient empires that started this war are quietly disintegrating from within, their multi-ethnic structures finally succumbing to pressures that have been building for generations. The Austria-Hungary that declared war on Serbia in 1914 bears little resemblance to the fragmenting collection of nationalities that limps toward 1918's end. Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled for 68 years and somehow held this impossible contraption together through personal authority alone, died in 1916, taking with him the last threads of legitimacy that bound Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Poles, Romanians, and a dozen other ethnic groups into a single political entity. His successor, Emperor Karl I, inherits a throne that's already crumbling beneath him. The new emperor, barely 30 years old and completely inexperienced in statecraft, finds himself ruling an empire where entire army units are deserting not to the enemy but to independence movements within his own territories. Hungarian regiments refuse orders from Austrian officers, Czech soldiers surrender en masse to Russian forces rather than fight for a government they no longer recognize as legitimate, and South Slavic units actively collaborate with Serbian forces who are supposed to be their enemies. The empire's military collapse accelerates as news of battlefield defeats combines with pandemic devastation to shatter whatever remains of imperial unity. In Prague, Czech nationalist leader Tom Masaryk declares the formation of a provisional government while Habsburg officials are still pretending to govern from Vienna. In Budapest, Hungarian politicians begin negotiating separately with Allied powers, effectively abandoning their Austrian partners to whatever fate awaits them. Most dramatically, in Zagreb, Croatian leaders proclaim their independence and immediately begin organizing their own national army from the remnants of former Austrian units. Here's a detail that captures the empire's surreal disintegration. By October 1918, Austrian postage stamps are being overprinted with the names of successor states that don't yet officially exist. while imperial bureaucrats continue filing reports to ministries in Vienna that have already been abandoned by their staff. The Habsburg administration simply evaporates, leaving behind a collection of ethnic groups who discover that they can organize their own governments more effectively than the empire ever managed to govern them. The Ottoman Empire's collapse follows a different pattern but reaches the same inevitable conclusion. Unlike Austria-Hungary's gradual fragmentation along ethnic lines, the Ottoman Empire implodes under the weight of simultaneous military disasters on multiple fronts. British forces advancing from Egypt finally captured Jerusalem in December 1917, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule over the Holy Land. Meanwhile, Arab nationalist forces, supported by British advisors like T. E. Lawrence, launch a revolt that spreads across the Arabian Peninsula like wildfire. The Arab Revolt represents something unprecedented in Middle Eastern history, a coordinated uprising that unites Bedouin tribes, urban intellectuals, and religious leaders against Ottoman rule. These diverse groups, who had spent centuries fighting each other, discover that they share a common desire to expel the Turkish administrators who have governed their lands since the 16th century. British weapons and gold help coordinate their efforts, but the revolt's real strength comes from a shared vision of Arab independence that transcends traditional tribal and religious divisions. T. E. Lawrence, the enigmatic British officer who becomes known as Lawrence of Arabia, provides military expertise that transforms scattered tribal raids into strategic campaigns capable of disrupting Ottoman supply lines across hundreds of miles of desert territory. His innovations include using camel-mounted forces equipped with machine guns and explosives to attack the Hejaz Railway, the vital transportation link that connects Constantinople with the empire's Arabian territories. Each successful raid further isolates Ottoman garrisons and demonstrates that the empire can no longer protect its outlying provinces. But the most devastating blow to Ottoman power comes not from external enemies but from internal collapse caused by the same combination of military defeat and pandemic disease that's destroying Austria-Hungary. Turkish conscripts, already demoralized by years of unsuccessful campaigns, begin deserting in massive numbers as news arrives that influenza is ravaging their home villages. Entire army units simply melt away as soldiers abandon their posts to care for sick family members or participate in food riots that are erupting across Anatolia. The empire's economic infrastructure, never robust even in peacetime, completely breaks down under the strain of supporting military operations on multiple fronts while coping with pandemic-related disruptions. Ottoman currency becomes essentially worthless as the government prints money to pay expenses it cannot otherwise afford. Food shortages, already severe due to British naval blockade, become catastrophic as agricultural labor is disrupted by military conscription and influenza mortality. In Constantinople itself, bread riots become so common that they barely merit mention in official reports. Here's a shocking detail about the Ottoman Empire's final months. Turkish government officials begin secretly negotiating with Allied representatives while publicly proclaiming their determination to fight to the end. These negotiations reveal just how completely Ottoman leadership has lost touch with reality. They're offering territorial concessions that they no longer actually control while demanding guarantees for frontiers that exist only on increasingly outdated maps. The empire's multi-ethnic character, once a source of strength that allowed Ottoman administrators to govern diverse populations across 3 continents, now becomes a fatal weakness as various ethnic groups pursue their own independence movements. Armenian nationalists, despite suffering terrible persecution during the war's early years, continue organizing resistance movements in eastern Anatolia. Greek communities along the Aegean coast begin preparing for union with Greece. Kurdish tribes in southeastern Turkey start asserting autonomy that effectively removes entire regions from Ottoman control. Perhaps most tellingly, even Turkish nationalist leaders begin distancing themselves from the Ottoman government, preparing for a post-imperial future that will prioritize Turkish ethnic identity over the multi-ethnic Ottoman legacy. Mustafa Kemal, the military commander who successfully defended Gallipoli in 1915, emerges as the leader of a Turkish nationalist movement that explicitly rejects Ottoman imperialism in favor of a modern nation-state based on Turkish ethnic identity. The simultaneous collapse of both Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire creates a power vacuum across Eastern Europe and the Middle East that will shape international politics for the rest of the 20th century. The Balkan Peninsula, which sparked the original crisis in 1914, becomes a laboratory for ethnic nationalism as South Slavic peoples experiment with creating Yugoslavia. The Middle East fragments into a collection of new states whose borders reflect British and French colonial interests rather than ethnic or religious realities. By November 1918, the map of Europe and the Middle East is being redrawn not by peace negotiators but by the simple reality that two of history's most durable empires have simply ceased to exist. The world that emerges from their collapse will be dominated by nation-states based on ethnic identity rather than multi-ethnic empires based on dynastic legitimacy, a transformation that will create as many problems as it solves. As autumn 1918 settles over Europe's battlefields, German military leaders finally confront a mathematical reality that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. The spring offensive has consumed Germany's last reserves while achieving nothing more than temporary territorial gains that have since been recaptured by reinvigorated Allied forces. American troops are arriving in France at a rate of 300,000 per month, while German replacement drafts consist increasingly of 16-year-old boys and men over 40 who lack both the physical strength and military training needed for modern warfare. General Ludendorff, the architect of Germany's final gamble, experiences what can only be described as a nervous breakdown when he realizes that his strategic calculations have led the nation into an impossible situation. The man who had dominated German military planning since 1916 now spends entire days staring at situation maps that show Allied forces advancing along multiple fronts while German defensive positions crumble faster than they can be reinforced. His staff officers, many of whom have loyally supported his increasingly desperate strategies, begin suggesting that perhaps it's time to consider political solutions to military problems that have no military answers. The catalyst for Germany's capitulation comes from an unexpected source. Bulgaria, the least significant of the Central Powers, collapses first. Bulgarian forces, facing a reinvigorated Allied offensive launched from Greece, simply stop fighting on September 29, 1918. Within days, the Bulgarian government signs an armistice that removes 600,000 Axis troops from the war and opens a direct route for Allied forces to advance toward Austria-Hungary and southern Germany. This seemingly minor Balkan development creates a cascade effect that destabilizes the entire Central Powers alliance. Austria-Hungary's response to Bulgarian capitulation reveals just how fragmented the dual monarchy has become. Instead of coordinating with their German allies, Austrian leaders begin conducting separate peace negotiations with Allied representatives, effectively abandoning the alliance that has sustained their war effort for 4 years. Emperor Karl I, desperate to save whatever remains of his disintegrating empire, offers territorial concessions so extensive that they amount to voluntary dismemberment of the Habsburg domains. But the most shocking development occurs within Germany itself, where the supposedly invincible military hierarchy begins turning against its own political leadership. On September 28, 1918, Ludendorff himself approaches the German government with a proposal that amounts to military surrender disguised as diplomatic negotiation. The general who had promised decisive victory through superior strategy now admits that Germany's situation is hopeless and recommends immediate pursuit of an armistice based on President Wilson's 14 points. Here's a detail that captures just how rapidly German morale collapses. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had spent 4 years proclaiming his determination to fight until final victory, now spends most of his time at his hunting lodge, refusing to meet with military commanders who bring increasingly desperate reports from various fronts. The monarch who declared this war with such confidence in 1914 has essentially abdicated his responsibilities, leaving subordinates to negotiate the humiliating terms that will end his dynasty's 500-year rule over Germany. The German request for an armistice, transmitted through neutral Swiss channels on October 3, 1918, reaches President Wilson at a moment when Allied military superiority has become overwhelming. American, British, French, and Belgian forces are advancing along the entire Western Front, capturing German positions that had been considered impregnable just months earlier. More importantly, the German army is disintegrating from within as units refuse orders, desert en masse, or simply surrender rather than continue fighting a war they now recognize as unwinnable. Wilson's response to German overtures reveals the extent to which American entry has shifted the balance of diplomatic as well as military power. Instead of immediately agreeing to armistice negotiations, the American president demands concrete evidence that Germany is prepared to accept democratic government and genuine military defeat. Wilson's notes, exchanged over several weeks during October 1918, essentially required Germany to overthrow its existing political system as a precondition for peace negotiations. The effect of these diplomatic exchanges on German domestic politics proves more revolutionary than any battlefield defeat. Social democratic leaders, emboldened by evidence that the military situation is hopeless, begin demanding Kaiser Wilhelm's abdication and the establishment of a parliamentary democracy. Sailors at the naval base in Kiel mutiny rather than participate in a final suicidal attack on the British fleet. Workers in Berlin organize strikes that paralyze war production just when German forces need ammunition and supplies most desperately. By early November 1918, Germany is experiencing what amounts to a political revolution concurrent with military collapse. The Kaiser's government no longer controls major industrial centers, the navy has mutinied, and even supposedly loyal Prussian Guard units are refusing orders from officers who represent the old regime. Prince Max of Baden, appointed chancellor in a desperate attempt to create a more democratic government, discovers that he lacks the authority to govern a nation that has essentially ceased to function as a unified political entity. The armistice negotiations themselves take place in a railway carriage stationed in the forest of Compiègne, about 50 miles northeast of Paris. The location is deliberately chosen to emphasize Germany's humiliation, rather than meeting in some neutral capital where German negotiators might retain some dignity. Allied representatives require German officials to travel to what amounts to a mobile headquarters in a forest clearing. The symbolism is unmistakable. Germany is not negotiating from a position of strength but begging for terms that will prevent complete national destruction. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French commander who leads the Allied negotiating team, presents terms that amount to German military capitulation rather than a negotiated settlement. Germany must immediately evacuate all occupied territories, surrender most of its heavy weapons, allow Allied occupation of the Rhineland, and maintain the naval blockade that has already reduced German civilians to near-starvation conditions. These aren't armistice terms in any traditional sense. They're the conditions of surrender imposed by victorious powers on a defeated enemy. The German negotiating team, led by Matthias Erzberger of the Catholic Centre Party, faces an impossible choice between accepting humiliating terms and continuing a war that has already been lost. Erzberger, who had supported the war effort enthusiastically in 1914, now finds himself in the position of signing away everything that 4 years of sacrifice were supposed to achieve. His cables to Berlin describe the armistice terms as so harsh that they will make German recovery impossible, but military commanders respond that continued fighting will only make the eventual settlement even more punitive. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II finally abdicates, fleeing to neutral Holland rather than facing the revolutionary crowds that have taken control of Berlin. 2 days later, at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice takes effect, ending active hostilities on what will prove to be the most costly war in human history up to that point. At precisely 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11, 1918, something unprecedented in human experience occurs across the battlefields of Western Europe. The guns simply stop. After 1,564 days of continuous artillery bombardment that has provided the soundtrack to an entire generation's nightmares, an otherworldly silence descends over landscapes that many soldiers had begun to believe would echo with explosions until the end of time itself. The sudden absence of sound proves more shocking than any barrage, creating a moment of collective disorientation as millions of men struggle to comprehend what peace actually sounds like. The armistice takes effect with almost supernatural precision, as artillery crews who have been firing continuously for hours suddenly cease their bombardment mid-battery. Along a front that stretches from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps, the mechanical rhythm of modern warfare, machine gun chatter, shell explosions, rifle fire, and the constant rumble of supply wagons, vanishes as completely as if someone had turned off an enormous gramophone. Soldiers emerge cautiously from their trenches, many of them genuinely uncertain whether the silence represents genuine peace or simply an unusually long lull between bombardments. Here's a detail that captures the moment's surreal quality. Many veterans later report that the silence itself had a physical presence, pressing against their eardrums like a tangible weight after years of adapting to constant noise. Some soldiers actually experience panic attacks triggered not by explosions but by the absence of explosions, their nervous systems unable to process the idea that they no longer need to anticipate the next incoming shell. Medical officers treating shell shock cases discover that peace creates its own form of psychological trauma for men whose survival reflexes have become calibrated to perpetual danger. The immediate aftermath of the ceasefire reveals landscapes so devastated that they seem to belong to another planet entirely. No man's land, that narrow strip of earth between opposing trenches, has been transformed into something that defies description. A moonscape of overlapping shell craters where nothing grows, nothing moves, and nothing remains of the pastoral French countryside that existed just 4 years earlier. The silence allows men to hear sounds that have been masked by artillery for years. Wind whistling through the skeletons of destroyed trees, water trickling through shell holes that have become impromptu ponds, and the unsettling quiet of a landscape where even insects have been eliminated by years of chemical contamination. Soldiers on both sides of the lines react to peace with emotions that range from relief to confusion to something approaching grief. Many men discover that they've become so adapted to military routine that they genuinely don't know how to function without the structure imposed by constant threat. French poilus, who have spent 4 years dreaming of the moment when the shelling would stop, now find themselves unsure what to do with hands that no longer need to grip rifles or dig trenches. German soldiers, facing the reality of defeat along with the end of hostilities, experience the complex emotions of men who have survived something terrible only to discover that their survival comes at the cost of everything they thought they were fighting to preserve. The contrast between frontline reactions and civilian celebrations creates one of history's most poignant ironies. In Paris, London, and New York, crowds gather spontaneously to celebrate victory with parades, dancing, and champagne toasts that continue for days. Church bells ring, factory whistles blow, and strangers embrace in streets filled with confetti and patriotic songs. Meanwhile, just a few hundred miles away, the actual veterans of this victory stand in muddy trenches, staring at landscapes of such complete destruction that celebration seems almost obscene. Here's a striking detail about November 11th's immediate aftermath. Many soldiers report feeling more frightened by the silence than they ever were by artillery bombardments, because the constant noise had become their protection against thinking too deeply about what they were experiencing. The silence forces men to confront the full reality of what they've endured and witnessed, the friends they've lost, the things they've done, and the psychological changes that 4 years of industrial warfare have wrought in their personalities. The physical evidence of the war's toll becomes visible in ways that were impossible while fighting continued. With artillery silent, the true extent of the casualty toll becomes apparent as stretcher-bearers begin the grim task of recovering bodies from no man's land that have been lying exposed for months or even years. Some estimates suggest that over 700,000 bodies remain unburied along the Western Front alone, creating a public health crisis that will take years to resolve and leaving families across Europe without graves to visit or closure to their grief. The trenches themselves, those elaborately constructed underground cities that have housed millions of men for years, suddenly seem both pointless and impossible to abandon. Soldiers who have carved out small spaces of relative comfort in dugouts that represent months of back-breaking labor find themselves reluctant to leave positions that have become more familiar than their pre-war homes. Some units continue occupying their trenches for weeks after the armistice, uncertain whether they're supposed to maintain their positions or begin the process of demobilization. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of November 11th is how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary, how rapidly human beings adapt even to peace after adapting to unimaginable horror. Within hours of the ceasefire, soldiers on both sides begin the practical tasks of survival in peacetime, writing letters to families who may not know they're still alive, inventorying personal possessions that have survived 4 years of constant danger, and beginning the psychological process of trying to imagine civilian life after experiences that have fundamentally changed their understanding of human nature. The armistice creates immediate practical problems that nobody had thought to plan for during the years when victory seemed impossible to achieve. What do you do with millions of soldiers who have been trained to kill but now need to return to peaceful occupations? How do you demobilize armies that have become larger than entire pre-war populations? How do you transition war economies that have been producing nothing but instruments of destruction back to manufacturing civilian goods that most people have forgotten how to want? The silence also allows sounds that have been absent from European battlefields for years to return gradually to the devastated landscapes. Birds, incredibly, begin returning to areas that seemed permanently uninhabitable, their songs creating an almost unbearable poignancy for soldiers who had forgotten that such sounds existed. The natural world, it seems, possesses a resilience that allows recovery even from industrial-scale destruction, though the process will take decades and some environmental damage will prove permanent. As the first day of peace ends and darkness falls over battlefields where men no longer need to fear snipers or artillery observers, many soldiers experience something they haven't felt since 1914. the simple pleasure of seeing stars without worrying that their visibility might attract enemy fire. The November sky, no longer lit by muzzle flashes and exploding shells, reveals constellations that have remained unchanged while the world below them underwent the most radical transformation in human history. The silence that descended over Europe's battlefields in November 1918 proves deceptively peaceful, masking the reality that the war's most consequential battles are about to be fought not with artillery and machine guns but with maps, documents, and the kind of diplomatic maneuvering that will reshape the world more permanently than any military campaign. By January 1919, representatives from 32 nations converge on Paris for what they optimistically call a peace conference, though the negotiations that unfold in the ornate halls of Versailles will prove to be less about establishing lasting peace than about determining how to divide the spoils of victory among the winners. The Big Four who dominate these negotiations represent four entirely different visions of what peace should accomplish. President Woodrow Wilson arrives in Paris carrying his 14 points like a secular gospel, genuinely believing that this war has been fought to make the world safe for democracy and that rational men can create international institutions that will prevent future conflicts. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George comes with a more practical agenda focused on maintaining British naval supremacy while ensuring that Germany remains weak enough to pose no future threat to the Empire. French Premier Georges Clemenceau, nicknamed the Tiger, wants nothing less than Germany's complete dismemberment as compensation for the devastation inflicted on French soil. Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando pursues territorial gains that will establish Italy as a major Mediterranean power regardless of ethnic or historical justifications. What emerges from their months of negotiation is a treaty so punitive that it virtually guarantees future conflict while simultaneously failing to address the underlying causes that made the Great War possible in the first place. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination that started everything, imposes terms on Germany that go far beyond what any reasonable person would consider necessary for maintaining peace. Instead of creating a stable European balance of power, the treaty establishes conditions that will make German resentment and eventual revenge almost inevitable. The territorial provisions alone represent a level of national humiliation that no proud people can be expected to accept permanently. Germany loses Alsace-Lorraine to France, Ypres-Normandy to Belgium, and most devastating of all, the Polish corridor that separates East Prussia from the rest of Germany while giving the newly created Polish state access to the sea. The ancient German city of Danzig becomes a free city under League of Nations administration, while the coal-rich Saar Basin goes under French control for 15 years. These aren't minor border adjustments, they represent the amputation of territories that Germans have considered integral parts of their homeland for centuries. Here's a detail that captures the treaty's deliberately humiliating character. German representatives are not permitted to participate in the negotiations that determine their nation's fate. Instead, they're presented with a completed document and given 3 weeks to submit written objections, which the Allied powers then largely ignore. The ceremony at Versailles takes place in the same Hall of Mirrors where the German Empire was proclaimed in 1871, a deliberate symbolic reversal that emphasizes French revenge rather than international reconciliation. The military restrictions imposed on Germany reveal just how determined the Allies are to prevent any possibility of German resurgence. The German army is limited to 100,000 men, smaller than many police forces, while the navy is reduced to 6 battleships and prohibited from possessing submarines entirely. Germany is forbidden to maintain an air force, manufacture or import weapons, or maintain fortifications within 50 kilometers of the Rhine River. The left bank of the Rhine will be occupied by Allied forces for 15 years, creating a permanent reminder of German defeat and foreign domination. But the treaty's most poisonous provision proves to be Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause that assigns complete responsibility for the war and all its damages to Germany and its allies. This clause serves as the legal foundation for reparations payments that will theoretically compensate the Allies for their war costs, but the sums involved, initially calculated at 269 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $800 billion in today's currency, represent more than Germany's entire gross domestic product for several years. The reparations aren't designed to be paid. They're designed to keep Germany economically prostrate for generations. The peace settlement's approach to creating new nations from the ruins of defeated empires reveals the conference's fundamental contradiction between stated principles and practical politics. Wilson's doctrine of national self-determination sounds admirable in theory, but its application creates more problems than it solves. Czechoslovakia emerges as a supposedly democratic state that includes millions of Germans and Hungarians who never consented to Czech rule. Yugoslavia unites South Slavic peoples who share little beyond their opposition to Habsburg rule, creating a powder keg of ethnic tensions that will explode repeatedly over the following decades. Poland's recreation represents perhaps the most complex challenge facing the peacemakers, since Polish national territory hasn't existed for over a century and competing ethnic claims overlap in ways that make any boundary decision controversial. The Poland that emerges from Versailles includes millions of Germans, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Jews who find themselves citizens of a state they never chose to join. More problematically, Poland's borders can only be defended with the support of Western powers who may not always be willing or able to provide such support. Here's a shocking detail about the peace settlement's demographic impact. The new borders create approximately 25 million national minorities, people who find themselves living under governments dominated by ethnic groups they consider foreign. This represents the largest forced population transfer in European history up to that point, creating resentments that will fuel nationalist movements and ethnic conflicts for the rest of the 20th century. The treaty's economic provisions demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern economies function. By stripping Germany of its colonies, merchant marine, foreign investments, and industrial patents while simultaneously demanding massive reparations payments, the Allies create conditions that make German economic recovery impossible. But a prostrate Germany cannot purchase Allied exports, repay its debts, or contribute to European economic stability. The reparations regime essentially requires Germany to become wealthy enough to pay vast sums to its former enemies while preventing it from engaging in the economic activities that would make such payments possible. Perhaps most tragically, the Versailles settlement ignores the fundamental changes that the war has brought to European society and politics. The negotiators act as if they can restore the pre-1914 balance of power through territorial adjustments and military restrictions, failing to recognize that the war has unleashed social and political forces that make such restoration impossible. The rise of Bolshevism in Russia, the collapse of traditional social hierarchies, and the emergence of mass political movements based on ethnic nationalism all represent challenges that the peace settlement simply pretends don't exist. The treaty signing ceremony on June 28, 1919, takes place amid celebrations that seem pathetically disconnected from the document's actual contents. Allied leaders congratulate themselves on creating a peace that will last for generations, while German representatives sign under protest, publicly declaring that they're submitting to force rather than accepting the treaty's justice. Count von Brockdorff-Rantzau, the head of the German delegation, refuses even to stand while signing, symbolically rejecting the legitimacy of the entire proceeding. As the delegates depart Paris and return to their respective capitals, they leave behind a settlement that contains the seeds of future conflicts more poisonous than the original disputes that caused the Great War. The Versailles Treaty doesn't establish peace. It establishes a temporary cessation of hostilities that virtually guarantees renewed warfare as soon as Germany recovers sufficient strength to challenge the imposed order. The men who return home from the Great War carry more than duffel bags and military decorations. They bring with them invisible wounds that will reshape families, communities, and entire nations in ways that no government official thought to anticipate during the euphoric celebrations of November 1918. These survivors represent the largest population of traumatized veterans in human history up to that point. Men who have witnessed and participated in forms of industrial violence that no previous generation could have imagined. Their struggle to readjust to civilian life will prove as challenging as any battle they fought in the trenches, and their success or failure will determine whether the peace so dearly purchased can actually be sustained. The physical evidence of the war's toll becomes impossible to ignore as demobilized soldiers flood back into civilian society. European cities fill with men missing limbs, bearing facial disfigurements, or struggling with respiratory damage from poison gas exposure. The lucky ones display their injuries openly, wearing empty sleeves or walking with prosthetic limbs that at least explain their difficulties in finding employment or maintaining relationships. The unlucky ones suffer from invisible damage, lung scarring that makes physical labor impossible, neurological trauma that causes unpredictable seizures, or psychological wounds that manifest as violent nightmares, uncontrollable tremors, and an inability to tolerate sudden noises. Here's a detail that reveals the war's unprecedented scale of human damage. By 1920, over 280,000 British veterans are receiving disability pensions for war-related injuries, while an estimated 65,000 men have been classified as totally disabled by their military service. Similar numbers emerge from every combatant nation, creating a generation of men who require long-term medical care and economic support that societies struggling with post-war reconstruction can barely afford. The cost of caring for disabled veterans will continue for decades, a permanent reminder of decisions made in the summer of 1914. The psychological aftermath proves even more challenging than physical injuries, partly because the medical profession lacks adequate understanding of what they're encountering. Shell shock becomes the catch-all term for a range of psychiatric conditions that include what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, clinical depression, and various anxiety disorders. Veterans describe symptoms that include recurring nightmares about trench warfare, panic attacks triggered by automobile backfires that sound like artillery, and a persistent sense that civilian concerns are trivial compared to the life-and-death struggles they've experienced. Many veterans discover that they cannot simply resume their pre-war lives as if 4 years of unprecedented experience had never occurred. Men who left home as teenagers return as adults who have seen entire landscapes destroyed, watched friends die in ways that defy description, and learned to kill other human beings with an efficiency that horrifies their peacetime selves. The young bank clerk who marched off to war in 1914 returns as someone who has commanded men in battle, made decisions that determined who lived and who died, and developed survival skills that have no application in civilian employment. The social fabric of entire communities bears the scars of losses that go far beyond simple casualty statistics. Villages across rural France, Britain, and Germany erect war memorials that list more names than the communities can afford to lose. The baker's son, the blacksmith's apprentice, the schoolmaster's eldest boy, entire cohorts of young men whose absence creates economic and social disruption that ripples through generations. These aren't just individual tragedies but collective wounds that alter the character of places that will never fully recover their pre-war vitality. Women who entered the workforce during wartime face their own difficult transition as returning soldiers reclaim jobs that women had proven capable of performing. The independence and economic autonomy that many women discovered while working in munitions factories, driving ambulances, or managing farms suddenly disappears as society attempts to restore pre-war gender roles that no longer reflect post-war realities. This creates tension within families where women have grown accustomed to making their own decisions while men struggle to reassert authority that 4 years of military service may have actually undermined rather than strengthened. The war's impact on children proves particularly poignant, as an entire generation grows up with fathers they barely remember or never knew at all. War orphans become a distinct social category requiring institutional support that overwhelms existing charitable organizations. More subtly, children who do have returning fathers often find themselves living with men who have been fundamentally changed by experiences they cannot share or explain. The bedtime stories of pre-war childhood give way to a silence about adult experiences too terrible for family conversation. Here's a striking detail about the war's lasting psychological impact. Many veterans report that they feel more comfortable with their former enemies than with civilians who never experience combat. German and French veterans sometimes find that they understand each other better than they understand their own families, sharing a bond forged by common experience of industrial warfare that transcends national boundaries. This creates a peculiar form of international solidarity among men who were trained to kill each other but who now recognize their shared trauma. The economic disruption caused by demobilization compounds the social challenges of reintegrating millions of former soldiers into peacetime society. War industries that employed entire cities suddenly shut down as military contracts expire, creating unemployment that coincides with the return of men seeking civilian jobs. The result is economic competition between veterans who feel entitled to employment as compensation for their service and civilian workers who maintained war production while soldiers were fighting. The war also fundamentally alters political consciousness in ways that make pre-war assumptions about social hierarchy and political deference obsolete. Men who have served as sergeants and lieutenants, making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, return to civilian societies that expect them to resume subordinate positions in social and economic hierarchies they may no longer respect. This creates potential for political radicalization that manifests differently in different countries but everywhere challenges traditional authority structures. Perhaps most importantly, the war destroys the optimistic faith in human progress that characterized the pre-1914 world. The generation that experienced the Great War learns that technological advancement can increase human suffering rather than reduce it, that civilized nations can engage in barbarism that exceeds anything in recorded history, and that rational human beings can create systems of destruction that operate with mechanical efficiency. This knowledge shapes political choices, cultural expressions, and social relationships for the rest of the 20th century. The veterans who carry these lessons forward become the fathers, teachers, political leaders, and cultural figures who will shape the next generation's understanding of human nature and international relations. Their experiences inform the policies that lead to the Second World War, the social movements that challenge existing institutions, and the artistic expressions that reflect humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction. As we drift toward the end of this long and terrible story, let your breathing slow and deepen, like those soldiers who finally learned to sleep peacefully again after years of listening for artillery fire that never came. The battles have ended, the empires have fallen, and the survivors have returned to rebuild a world that will never quite be the same. But in that rebuilding lies something hopeful: the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find meaning even in experiences that test the very limits of what people can survive. The trenches have been filled in, though if you know where to look in the fields of northern France, you can still trace their faint outlines in the grass. The battlefields have become quiet meadows where poppies grow, their red petals a gentle reminder of sacrifice that time has softened into memory. The young men who marched away to the sound of brass bands rest now in countless graves across Europe, their names carved in stone that will outlast the empires they served. And you, settling deeper into rest as this long tale concludes, can let yourself imagine that final silence, not the terrible quiet that followed the guns in November 1918, but the peaceful silence that comes when even the longest stories finally end, when the last page closes, and when all the brave and frightened young people of a century ago can finally rest alongside your own peaceful sleep.